Welcome to the Algorithm Seminar. I'm very pleased today to have Michael Albert as a speaker. He's a professor in the data analytics and decision sciences area at University of Virginia Darden School of Business. His research focuses on combining machine learning and algorithmic techniques to automate the design of markets. His work has appeared in leading AI conferences and journals like ICHCAI, AAAI, and also OR journals. Prior to joining Darden, Michael received his PhD in financial economics at Duke, at Fuqua, the business school. He's worked also as a professor at Ohio State University and has been a postdoc at UT Austin and at Duke. So very nice to have you here today.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's been a pleasure so far. And is it okay if I stand? I feel weird.
Yeah.
There's something sitting down. Okay. So this is today I'm going to be talking about is learning effective in dynamics for strategic interactions, evidence from Stackelberg games, and this is joint work with Minbao Han, who is currently a PhD student about to defend his dissertation next Monday at the University of Chicago, and Haifeng Zhu, who has collaborated with I think you collaborated with him, is that right? And maybe others have as well, and as well as Quinlan Dawkins, who's at AMD by way of an acquisition, and I can't remember the name of the company before that. But was an undergraduate at UVA when we started this work. So I want to start with a motivating example. I'm going to call it the fishmonger's problem. This name is due to a paper by Devener et al. I like the framing of the problem in this way, but it's certainly an older, more classic problem. We have a fishmonger who sells fish. He's got a fish that he catches every day, and we've got a guy who walks by his stall every day. This guy has a certain preference for fish. It doesn't change between days. There's no, if he gets fish one day, the guy doesn't want fish the next day. But the seller doesn't know what it is. And the seller gets to post a price every day. The guy walking by gets to accept the price or reject the price every day.
Sorry, if he's the same every day.
The buyer's the same every day. That's very important. Okay, so vote by objective is to maximize cumulative payoff during the interaction. It's going to be T rounds, and then the buyer dies, or the fishmonger retires, or whatever. So the seller is trying to maximize favor received. The buyer is trying to maximize value minus payment. The seller would like to know the buyer's value because it would let them set a better price. The buyer is motivated to hide the value. The question is, what is an optimal pricing policy for the seller? Anybody? So I know at least John knows the answer to this. Does anybody have any suggestions for a good pricing policy?
Commit to the optimal buyer's price for F and stick with it.
That's exactly right. Okay, so it's not a surprise that I'm going to refer to this classic folk theorem as the no learning theorem, but the basic takeaway is that the optimal dynamic pricing on the setting is static. You post the constant price P star, which maximizes the single period static price given your beliefs over the buyer's distribution of values, and then you stick with it. Which is a little bit maybe. Has everybody seen this result before? Is this surprising to anybody? This is maybe a little bit surprising to people who have not seen this result. That we can't actually do any effective learning here, right? We do learn something. This isn't certainly the fishmonger learns. He learns whether or not the value of the buyer is greater than or equal to P star. Because he identify if he sets P star, then the first day the buyer walks by, if the buyer buys fish, he knows that the buyer's going to buy fish every day for the rest of time. If he doesn't buy fish, he learns that he's never going to buy fish for the rest of time, right? And so you end up in this equilibrium where the payoff to the seller is all or nothing. And I think this is my reading of the literature is that this is has been very influential, this argument, for especially pricing, but also, and I'm going to start using the word follower as well, for also the learning in Stackelberg games setting. That the literature, because of results like this, has led to a lot of work in this space, adopting weakening assumptions that, for example, the buyer may be less patient than the seller. They might have a lower discount rate. The buyer might exhibit some form of myopia. They only care about the single round purchasing decision. The buyer might follow some kind of restricted strategy space. And I am fortunate that I did cite Thing et al. 2019, which is one of John's papers, although I didn't know that John was in the group until I met him earlier. Yes, but other papers both in pricing and in learning in Stackelberg games, where the assumption is that the follower is not necessarily playing an optimal strategy. Instead, they're playing some restricted strategy space, and we can then have positive results. The question that we ask in this paper is learning generally effective in strategic settings? Oh, I didn't say this earlier, but I'm very happy with questions at any point in the talk. So I'm from a business school where that's the standard. But if there's any questions, feel free to interrupt. So the question here is learning generally effective? It does something like the no pricing theorem. Is it likely to hold if I somehow take kind of an arbitrary game from the space of all possible kind of repeated Stackelberg games? Obviously we know that this doesn't hold in pricing settings, but how robust is this result? Okay, so what do we mean by learning being effective? Well, it's not that the leader or the seller in the pricing example doesn't learn something, because even in the pricing game, the seller learns something. They just don't get to use that information in any useful way. We want to, the question we're asking is can the seller take advantage of buyer's response to somehow distinguish between buyer types and tailor prices or actions accordingly, kind of in a more general setting? This is a policy that combines learning with utility optimization. So it's not just, we want to identify the type, but it's also we want to be able to exploit that information.
This is a question whether you can get strictly better payoffs than just by committing to a strategy and just playing it.
Exactly. The question is if I compare the optimal dynamic strategy, and there's a caveat there, but the optimal dynamic strategy to a repeated static strategy,
There's a gap.
is there a gap? And how? I mean, we know the answer is no in the pricing game, but the question is there a gap in general?
I think. So the question is exactly this: if there's a gap between static and dynamic.
Exactly. Well, there's a caveat, but I think the gap is a little bit more complicated, because even when there's no private information on the follower's side, there will be a gap between the dynamic and the repeated static strategy. So then that's not about learning, but I'll get to that in a second.
So one question. So for the previous example, when the seller cannot commit, is there learning?
When the seller cannot commit.
Yeah.
So this is the Morlick et al. 2017 paper is exactly it looks exactly at this setting, and there's other work in this space as well. There's been a pretty robust literature in the economics community around lack of commitment in contracting. And so in that case, you end up with a bunch of word equilibria that are almost always bad for the seller when you can't commit. Though it very much depends on how many bidders you have and a bunch of different assumptions. It gets pretty complicated when you allow for.
Yeah, but you mean bad is worse than the static price? But I wonder if there's still some learning there.
I see it's worse than the static price. It's pretty easy to see that if you can commit, you'll always be better off than if you can't commit, right? That's
that's the
just the lack of commitment is just an additional constraint on the optimization problem, right? But so I think that in committing to in the pricing setting, committing to a constant strategy is the optimal thing to do. So you end up worse off when you don't have the power of commitment. When the buyer doesn't have the power of commitment, I'm actually not sure what the results are.
I guess my question is different. Like when the seller cannot commit,
Yeah.
is this equilibrium dynamic having some learning element in it or not? It's like it's not necessarily comparing to the
It's
Look at like Nash equilibrium where they don't commit or something.
yeah. I remember Balu mentioned it's a very annoying equilibrium, but
I don't know.
I don't know how to think about that. This is
What are you asking? Like, what are you asking about the perfect Bayesian equilibrium? What exactly is the question?
like here you have this. There's this no learning theorem. I wonder, like in the case when you cannot commit, first of all, how do you define what is learning, and if there's learning in that equilibrium?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there is any learning there. Like, people are updating their beliefs in a Bayesian sense. And when people update their beliefs in a Bayesian sense and you result in this perfect Bayesian equilibrium, which is a generalization of subgame perfect equilibrium to Bayesian settings, then you get like very trivial revenue when compared to what you can get when you can commit.
Yeah, I'd love. I need to think about that more. I think is the question. My response. Also just saw Yuan's on the call. Good. Thanks for joining, Yuan. You know, he was a PhD student on his postdoc at Duke. Good to see you.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so I want to, why is learning in these settings important? First of all, I think there's a lot of settings where this is kind of a very natural model of what's going on, kind of contract design, and where you are have kind of recontracting. You have an opportunity to revisit the contract every so often. Security games where you don't necessarily know the value of different targets to attackers. Congestion games where you're not sure about the value of resources to the players in the games. But I think maybe at a higher level, I don't personally believe that most players of these kind of games are likely to be fully strategic. I think assuming some kind of weakening of the strategy space is probably right in practice. But I think there may be potential issues with that, right? I'm here at Google, and I understand you guys probably internalize this a lot more than I do as an academic. But I think that if users who do not understand, they're not acting strategically, they may at some point in the future become upset that the information that they shared was then used in a way that doesn't benefit them, right? And they would have wished to have behaved differently if they had kind of understood what their lack of strategic behavior would lead to. And so I think a strong argument against that is that if you can say, well, even though you didn't behave strategically, if you had, I could have still learned this about you, right? And even if you had kind of behaved optimally, I would have ended up in, kind of been learning the same information, exploiting the same information. Then I think that's maybe a stronger kind of moral argument. I don't know if that's a stronger legal argument, but it seems to me like it's a stronger, justification for why using that information was maybe fair in the interaction. Okay, so here's the goals in this talk, and we'll see how much of I get through. I've kind of been ambitious with the slides, but the first we'd like to understand is, does this no learning theorem generally hold strategic acceptance? And the answer to that is no. it doesn't. We argue that it does not. In a precise way, I'll make clear later. The next question we want to ask is, well, is it just because people would like their private information to be shared? Is learning just a substitute for direct communication? And the answer is a qualified no. That communication is not as, it's not that people are letting the leader in this setting learn because they would like their private information to be learned. And then we want to ask, can we compute the optimal strategy? And I think John's recent work has something interesting to say about this, but we say that no, and you can't generally compute the optimal strategy, but we come up with some heuristics that are a little bit more feasible. So there's a lot of related literature, learning the Stackelberg games. I won't go through a lot of it, but it's generally, I think this paper, Anantha Krishnan et al., they have a somewhat similar setting to us, but they talk about learning kind of a meta game before this Stackelberg game starts. So Yuan and John's paper looks at the setting where the follower follows a no regret learning algorithm, and how you can exploit that. There's
Also, Balder's paper, by the way.
Oh, okay. So it's a great paper. I'm glad I didn't. I cited it not just in the paper, but also in the slides. It is also related to the literature on learning optimal prices. Again, because of this negative no learning result, typically have to assume that buyers discount the future more steeply than sellers. They have limited commitment, or there's a restricted strategy space. This is also related to literature on dynamic mechanism design. Maybe the paper that is
Michael, sorry, one second. Your previous slide, there is a distinction between the two lines of work. One where values set as fixed, other where values are repeatedly being drawn. There's Amin et al., Mori, Munoz, they're all like repeatedly drawing values, no?
Amin et al. Is both of those papers are
so in the Imamika et al. Paper and the previous paper that we wrote, like the point is there is a value which is initially drawn, and after that it's a closely guarded secret for all the n interactions, right? And then people are like finding more and more based on the interactions, like with some Bayesian updates, like, where is this value lying? Like, you update your beliefs and so on.
Yeah.
They're drawing repeatedly, no?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it all is drawing repeatedly. That's a good point. There is a, I'd have to look back at the papers. But there is still learning about the distribution that they're drawn from, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that this is a generalization of the static value setting. But yeah, it's a good point, and it does change the problem a lot. And I think a lot less is known about the setting where there is a distribution that's drawn from every period, but the distribution is not known, at least not fully, by the principal or the leader.
Exactly. And there, like they say, buyers discount like more quickly than they can achieve, but if not, like you're going to get linear regrets.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks for the distinction. So the paper that maybe is most closely related to ours, that we're aware of at least, is Balsero et al. 2021. They look at a dynamic mechanism design setting, and where there's a designer and a single participant in the mechanism, and they are interested in coming up with the kind of the mechanism that achieves the maximum utility among a set of possible distributions. And they give a condition under which basically learning, for the set of possible distributions, learning is impossible. Interestingly, their condition applies in our setting, and yet we show that learning is actually generally possible. And so this is a distinction between the max-min setting and the and kind of this average case setting that we're the expected value setting that we're in. It's also related to dynamic contracts and the ratchet effect, which is generally more about lack of commitment than in our work. We're interested in full commitment, where we are focused on exploiting these fully strategic interactions. Okay, so the outline of the talk, I'm going to go through a basic model for a Stackelberg game, Bayesian Stackelberg game. I will talk about a sufficient condition for learning and go through our average case analysis. We'll talk about communication versus learning, and then computing the dynamic Stackelberg equilibrium. And assuming there's time, I may talk about a couple of other papers that I've been working on that might be of interest to the group. So the basic framework for a dynamic Bayesian Stackelberg game is that there is a leader who sets a strategy, and then the follower responds to that strategy. So we're going to assume discrete actions. So the leader will have M actions, and the follower will have N actions. The leader will have a utility matrix of R and a follower of C. And the leader's utility is just going to be the dot product between their strategy chosen from the distribution over actions and whatever action the column of their utility matrix that corresponds to the action by the follower. And similarly, the follower will have a similar utility. We will assume that the follower can have a type. What this type means is that they have a different utility matrix. That's the leader here does not have a type, and their utility, for the purposes of this talk, will not depend on the follower's type. This can be extended to let the leader's utility depend on the follower's type. But for the purpose of this talk, the leader's utility only depends on the follower's action. And there's a known prior distribution over the types mu. This game is played over T rounds, and in principle, the leader can set the policy based on all little t minus 1 actions at time little t by the follower. This policy is fully known to the follower. So the follower chooses a set of responses that optimize over the entire sequence of play and maximizes the follower's cumulative utility. So we assume the leader both commits and reveals their policy. Any questions about the setup?
Any randomness?
There's no randomness except for the initial draw of the type. So the follower's type theta is drawn from the prior distribution. That's the only randomness, and without loss of generality, once the policy is set, the follower doesn't need to play any randomly. So the next sequence of actions by the follower is optimal.
So the leader's policy is deterministic.
It's again without loss of generality. But the output of the policy is a distribution over actions. It's not an action itself. So the policy outputs a distribution over actions. Nice. So the policy itself is random, but the actual policy that's output by the strategy that's output by the policy is deterministic.
So can XT depend on the previous round's randomness?
The previous actions by the follower do not depend. They're not random, and so there's no randomness that ends up in the policy itself here.
Sorry, just clarify. So each X here is distribution.
That's right.
But the policy only depends on the follower's actions, not what the distribution actually selected at each round.
And that's without loss of generality.
It is? Okay.
Because there's no the follower's action is chosen before the realization of the action from the policy, and all the information comes from there's no sequential dependence between the actions of the leader directly. It's not like if I chose action A in round 2 that I'm going to choose action B in round.
I think assuming the raws are fractional, so I brought it. Yeah. Instead of expectation, it doesn't.
Oh, I see.
Expectation doesn't matter, right? Fine. Got it. Okay. Everything's an expectation.
And the J's are deterministic, and that's also without. But that's just an artifact of the following next.
Exactly, because of the Stackelberg game. Right. The J's are deterministic. Without loss generality, they're very deterministic. Good. Any other questions? Right. So a Bayesian Stackelberg equilibrium is the strategy that maximizes leader utility when t equals 1. So t equals 1, there's uncertainties here. There's obviously no learning. It would be the strategy that it doesn't condition on any previous actions, obviously, but it maximizes utility for t equals 1. That's going to be our baseline optimal repeated static strategy. The dynamic Stackelberg equilibrium maximizes leader's cumulative utility under the follower's corresponding best response sequence over all, t rounds. Okay. So here's an example game. So we have two actions with the leader and the follower. The leader strategy is a distribution over these two actions. So it's an element of the one simplex, standard one simplex. Followers best respond with either J0 or J1. And and the leader's utility, if they play a strategy that plays I naught with probability X naught and I1 with probability X1, and then the follower best responds with J1, their utility corresponds to to this here. That's great. The leader and the follower interact for 2 rounds, and we assume that this theta, this either 0 or 1 type, is drawn uniformly from over these 2 types. So the optimal single round strategy for this game happens to be to play the first action I naught with 1/3 probability and I1 with 2/3 probability, giving the leader expected utility of 5 and a 6. And in this setting, under this single round strategy, the leader does actually learn what the types are. C naught, the type 0 plays J naught, type 1 plays J1, and so there's fully distinguishes the types. But in the for the static strategy, they can't exploit this. The optimal dynamic policy is to play I1 with probability 1 in the first round. And then if the follower responds with J naught, to play 0, 1 again. If they respond with J1, you play half-half. And C naught responds with J naught, while C1 responds with J1. And this leads to a leader's dynamic utility of 5 and 3/8, which is greater than the 5 and 1/6. Now, if we so here's how we define effective learning precisely for a dynamic Bayesian Stackelberg game, which is this combination of leader utility, theta, and then the follower sets of utilities and a distribution over these types. If there exists a theta and theta prime, such that the leader's policy differs based on the 2 different response histories. That what the actions that the leader plays does change based on the response histories of the followers, which necessarily means that the followers have different response histories, and that the leader exceeds the repeated BSE strategy for T rounds. Okay, so let's look at this game again. What if the leader does know the types? Well, the optimal static strategies with full knowledge is, in the C naught case, is to play 1, 0 with utility of 5, and to play 1/3, 2/3 in the C1 case with utility of 5 and a 1/3. Which, since there's a 50% chance of each of the types being chosen, this actually averages out to the 5 and 1/6. And these are both less than the optimal dynamic strategy when the types are not known. Why is that? In the setting, full knowledge didn't actually help the leader improve their utility. In fact, they end up with the same expected utility of 5 and a 6, even if they go into a world where they now know exactly what these types are. It's because in this case, this dynamic strategy is not actually exploiting learning. What it's doing, there is some learning happening here. It's that a dynamic strategy is always going to be more powerful than a repeated static strategy, right? There's more degrees of freedom. You can exploit behavior in different ways. And so here we see that there's a complication to try to understand whether or not learning is effective, because even in situations under which knowing the true type doesn't actually help you, doesn't improve your repeated static strategies, the dynamic strategy can end up with a higher utility.
There's not a folk theorems at all, like that by playing repeatedly, you can incentivize different behaviors.
Exactly, right? I mean, well, then it's really just a relaxation of a constraint, right? If you have this, broader strategy space, of course, right? And so, as we kind of go through and try to understand if learning is effective, one question we need to disentangle is the learning due to commitment, or is the increase in utility due to commitment, or is the increase in utility due to actually exploiting information about the followers?
You can also get this gap though if there's like only one type, right? Like where there's like no information about the followers, just from like.
Oh yeah, so here in this case, if you had a dynamic strategy with a single type, so there was no, then you would end up with utility greater than 5 or 5 1/3, right? The dynamic strategy would achieve higher utility even with a single type, because again, commitment gives you some power irrespective of learning, right? And so the question is, can we do better? I mean, are we doing better because we're learning, or are we doing better because we just have this ability to commit, right? And so we need to disentangle these two things. Okay, so let's go back to the fishmonger's problem. And I'm going to reframe it as a Bayesian Stackelberg game where there's 3 possible types. One values fish at $8, one values fish at $35, and one values fish at $96. And then the seller can, without loss of generality, play strategies that correspond to charging $8 for the fish, $35 for the fish, or $96 for the fish. The buyer's actions are accept or reject. Excuse me, in this particular case with uniform distribution over the types, the optimal Meyerson price is to charge $96 for the fish, and the single round expected revenue is $32, 1/3 of 96. And for T rounds, the optimal expected dynamic seller utility is 32 times the number of rounds. Let's take this and modify it a little bit. So here I'm going to say, this is basically the same game, except instead of charging $8, $35, $96, I assume that the seller can only offer the prices 22, 40, or 61. And if these numbers look kind of arbitrary, it's because they were randomly generated. It turns out this holds quite often. And randomly generating this game was easy. In this case, the optimal static pricing policy is to offer the mixed strategy of 5/18 of 22, 13/18 of 40, which leads to an expected price of 35. So what happens here is you sell to the guy who values it at $8 or $35, and you end up with an expected revenue of 23 1/3 versus the Meyerson revenue of 32. The question is, why don't we achieve the Meyerson price and the optimal static pricing policy? It's because it's the Meyerson price is higher than any price that we can offer. In this case, it's not in our possible pricing set to offer the Meyerson price. So what's the optimal 2-round dynamic policy? Well, in this case, we actually can learn. So in round 1, we offer an expected price of $61. If the high type, if the buyer accepts, then we know that they are the $96 value type. So we offer $61 again. If they don't accept it, we drop down to a price of $35. So even though this is basically the same structured game, by reformulating it so that the Meyerson price is outside of our kind of range of prices, learning is now effective again. In this case, the expected revenue is 26 1/6 in each round, or average over the rounds. It is greater than 23 1/3, which is the repeated optimal static policy. Okay, so with a relatively small modification of the pricing game, and again, we don't achieve as good. Our price here is lower than the optimal Meyerson revenue because we can't, achieve that with the setting here. We now recover the ability to learn effectively. So how robust is that? Well, first thing we do is we provide a sufficient condition for learning to be effective. And I'll be honest, I don't actually think the sufficient condition is all that interesting. It's more, I think, leverage for our next step here. What we need is given this optimal static strategy, this BSE of X star. We need there to exist a subgroup of the set of possible types, such that the static strategy, optimal static strategy for that subgroup is not X star. AKA, we would like to actually change to a different strategy for some subset of types. And we need for this subset of types, we need their best response set to the optimal strategy to be disjoint from the other types. What this means is that, when we're playing against a set of types, if we were playing the repeated static strategy, this subset would play differently than those who, than the rest of the types. This is not, maybe this, if you think about this assumption for a little while, maybe it's somewhat obvious how we exploit this to show that we can learn effectively. But what we do here is we construct a strategy that will outperform the repeated optimal static strategy, which is playing X star over and over again, by basically playing X star for the first T-1 rounds. If the followers play an action that's in their best response set, then we know that we must be playing against somebody in theta prime. If they play for all rounds less than T-1, they play this action. Then in the last round, we switch to the equilibrium that we prefer against them. And because their best response set are disjoint, we can kind of exploit this to provide a carrot for them to continue playing their action for the first T-1 rounds. And importantly here, this strategy is switching us from one optimal static strategy to a different optimal static strategy in the final round. This is a strategy that's only about learning. Commitment is not, is used to switch from one static strategy to another, but we're not ever exploiting the fact that we can, offer dynamic strategies to improve our utility. This strategy, it fully relies on learning, not commitment. Okay, so we have this assumption that ensures we can learn effectively in these games. And the question then becomes is this assumption reasonable? We know it doesn't hold for pricing games. In fact, the thing that doesn't hold for pricing games is that the response set is not disjoint. The marginal type, the type that's on the fence between buying and not buying at the Meyerson price, always is indifferent between rejecting or accepting. And so the response set is not disjoint. And so we know it doesn't hold in general. The question is, does it hold in some sense often? To answer this, we define the notion of a random Bayesian Stackelberg game, which basically adds a distribution over the followers' utility matrices, C theta. And what the approach we're going to use is we're going to argue that under some condition we find reasonable in the distribution, that as the number of types increases, the likelihood that you can learn effectively approaches 1. That somehow the measure of games under which you can learn effectively is nearly all games, right? That it's very unlikely if you were drawing games kind of randomly from the set that you would end up with one that you can't learn from. We know that we restrict this distribution F to only generate pricing games. Well, then it's not going to. We're not going to end up showing that assumption holds with high probability, right? So we need some assumption over the distribution. And I'm not sure we found the weakest one, but we have one that we think is maybe reasonable. This is the assumption. There's a lot here, but effectively, this distribution F is going to induce a distribution over the difference between the columns of the follower's utility matrix. And our major assumption here is that this distribution is even. That if you look at the X being the difference between two columns of the follower's utility matrix, that saying X versus negative X are kind of equally likely in some sense. And I think the basic intuition for this is that there isn't a preferred leader action. That over kind of the set of types, you're in some sense one type is likely to prefer one leader action to other leader actions. So there's a question about how reasonable this is in some games. I think in things like security games, this makes a lot of sense when you don't, some targets are likely to be more valuable than other targets for different sets. Maybe, but it's obviously doesn't hold in pricing games where all types prefer the low price action to high price actions. So let's try to provide a little bit more intuition here. So consider the leader having an action space of 3 and the follower having an action space size 2. We can represent the leader strategy space by the simplex, and the difference between the columns, where they really define as an indifference curve between the two actions that the follower has. So kind of on this side of the curve, the follower prefers to play J naught for any leader strategy in this space. On this side, the follower prefers to play J1. If we have another type, we see that we've just partitioned the space into different sets under which different types play different actions. So kind of up here, they both play J naught. Over here, type 1 plays J naught, type 2 plays J1, and over here, the reverse. So every time we add a type, we kind of partition the space more and more. And importantly, there's only one partition in here that corresponds to, at most one partition that corresponds to everybody playing the same action for any given action. The assumption that phi is even is that kind of these two types are equally likely. And what this means is that you have a type that's equally likely where you reverse the kind of best response space to the other one. And the pricing does not satisfy evenness. So the main technical difficulty here is showing that given this evenness assumption, that we end up with these disjoint best response sets. And in large part, that's because we don't know where X star is going to be. So instead, we have to prove something stronger. What we need to prove that as you increase the number of types, the probability that there exists any strategy in the space for which every type best responds in the same way goes to 0. And we do this geometrically. So I'm going to provide some brief proof intuition here. So let's assume we have a bunch of types. They're kind of slicing up this strategy space, and only one of these kind of regions correspond to, currently at least, everybody best responding in the same way. Best responding with a single action. This is I naught here. So in that little red region, everybody best responds with I naught. If we add another type, well, there's two possibilities. One, it can intersect that region. If it intersects it, it makes it smaller, because only one side of the region now becomes the region where everybody best responds in the same way. Or it can not intersect it. If it doesn't intersect it, there's two possibilities here. If this line now corresponds to, this side of this line corresponds to the same response that we're targeting, well, then the region stays the same. But if the best response is on the other side of this line, the response in this region is on the other side of this line, then the size of this region now goes to 0, because there's now no longer any region where everybody best responds in the same way. And so we need to argue that this red region gets small enough that the probability that a new line intersects it goes to 0. And then once we have that, we can just say, okay, well, if a new line doesn't intersect it, there's basically a coin flip because of the evenness assumption that the size of that region goes all the way to 0. We do this by thinking about the simplex not in kind of 2 dimensions here, but as an embedding in 3 dimensions. An indifference curve now becomes a plane that goes through the origin that intersects with the simplex. And then we look at how, because the geometry here is a little bit weird when you look at it in this way, we can't kind of use standard results and stochastic geometry in this space. we instead think about the simplex being embedded in the, or being projected onto the surface of a sphere, and each plane being, great circles on that sphere where those planes intersect the sphere. And the indifference curves become, more great circles. So here it's rotated, but this is the same set of indifference curves. We end up with that same kind of indifference region. And we can use results from stochastic geometry and the tessellation of hyperspheres to show that this region gets small enough that the probability of intersection goes the expected size of this region gets small enough, and that the probability of intersection with the new hyperplane is very low. And then we can make the argument that's size of that goes all the way to 0. Which that gives us the kind of the result that the second part of the assumption holds. And then it turns out that the existence of a subgroup where the Bayesian Stackelberg equilibrium is distinct from that subgroup is a much simpler thing to show. And in that case, we end up showing that the probability of assumption 1 is not satisfied is big O of 1 over the number of types. So as you increase the number of types, the probability that you can learn approaches 1 linearly.
Is there any quantifiable version of this result? You don't have learning or not learning, but maybe you could quantify to what extent do you learn, like, I guess the things like as a increase of times, because possible to learn, but learn very little.
Well, so there is our initial kind of result back here relies on T star being kind of, or T being large enough. And so but we are not just saying we have the optimal dynamic policy. This is not the optimal dynamic policy. And our dynamic policy is actually quite like simple, right? It's play one thing for a while, somebody responds consistently, switch to the other thing, right? For the last round. But how quickly we can switch depends on it's kind of in some sense how much you prefer, to play the action in your best response set versus an action in the other best response set, right? And we have I'm actually not going to get to that, but we do use that in our communication piece of this here. But so this because we just rely on the fact of we just show that this assumption holds. Assumption is learning possible or not. We don't currently have kind of a degree of learning, but I think you could impose conditions under which you would get something like you can learn under a smaller number of rounds, right? Does that make sense?
Right, makes sense.
Yeah, another question. So if you add the additional round 0 in the beginning, that the buyer to report their type.
Great question. That's the question is, okay, what if you just ask them to report their type?
That problem become trivial.
Yeah, is it because? And the answer here is like if they could just say, hey, I want you to know this about me, right? Does that mean that the rest of the learning is irrelevant? The answer is no. What we show is that given this inducibility gap, which I think is related to your question, that might have to go offline. We show that that an error strategy can always be almost as good as the optimal policy that allows communication. So this is instead we're opening the strategy space to one that allows communication. Is actually a little bit broader than that. Because it allows for distributions over distributions, which is a little bit more powerful here.
Yeah, so that's the theorem I was actually after. If you had like some bounds of how quickly you can learn, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So this is what we show is that here in this case that you need this kind of inducibility gap, which is basically a way to incentivize this kind of communication step. But in that we show this kind of a 1 over root T gap between this optimal communication in the worst case, and we show that there are settings under which pure learning, again not connected, pure learning ends up with a strictly greater utility, omega 1 over T. So that game is this game here, where we show that we can learn without communication. We can end up with a gap of T over 2 over the whole route of play.
So you wrote the communication with a static policy.
Communication with a static policy versus, so if you allow communication with a dynamic policy, that can always do certainly better than just a dynamic policy.
Yes, I'm asking if you have communication with dynamic policy, is the equilibrium, like whatever solution is like trivial because everyone just report their type truthfully in the beginning by some revelation principle.
Yeah. Yes, there's always, if in a dynamic, if you have a menu of dynamic policies, you can recover kind of a revelation principle kind of architecture, right? But you have to offer a menu of dynamic policies that that distinguishes among the types, right?
Yeah.
But that's that I think is learning in this sense is somewhat trivial, but not really, because it's not clear that this menu is going to necessarily provide any more value than a repeated static strategy. It won't provide worse stuff, right?
Yeah.
But it's
Sorry, a follow-up question. Like you have this example that you can only choose price in a discrete set, restricted set, right? And
sure.
And I think there the static price versus the dynamic price has the difference in the dynamic setting because you have many rounds. You can make the average price simulating the Meyerson price.
No, because the Meyerson price is strictly higher than what you can offer. So
All the everything.
I mean, even in one round, you can simulate any price kind of in the bounds, right? By having a randomized strategy. Like an expectation is all that the follower cares about, right? So you don't even need repeated rounds to do this. You only need a single round to kind of simulate the price and expectation.
So it's not coming from like
if the Meyerson price is within the set of prices you can offer, is between the set of prices you can offer, then you'll recover the state of no learning result in that result. I'm conscious of time, and I imagine somebody will be knocking on that door in just a second to get us out. So the computing the equilibrium, we come up with a MILP. I don't think it's a major contribution of the paper. We also have a couple of heuristic policies. What the basic takeaway is that dynamic Stackelberg equilibrium does meaningfully outperform the kind of optimal static policy with communication in kind of some toy games we look at, and also in randomized games. We do some computational time studies as well. But the general takeaway is that given an assumption that we think is maybe somewhat reasonable about games, the distribution of games, that in general, with lots of types, learning should be very likely to be possible. Visibility is not just due to communication. We can show that even if we do better than in settings where you can offer a static policy with some kind of communication step. And then we have some computational results as well. I will not talk about. We got some recent work on data auctions for RAG data, and some work on adjusting kind of data-driven pricing that I'm happy to talk about offline. But I think I'll leave it there due to time, and happy to take any questions up to the point where they knock on the door, I suppose.